It's a plane that would have never have been built today. It burns up to 20 tons of fuel an hour, and it's too large for a third of the world's airports. But this Cold War relic was built to do what no other aircraft in the world could: lift enormous components for the Soviet space program, and even launch spacecraft into orbit by serving as an air launch platform. The Soviets had big plans for this plane, but by the time they unveiled it to the world at the 1989 Paris Air Show, it was a plane built for a future that would never be. In 1982, the Soviet Union begins airlifting components of a new space launch system, strapping enormous parts to the back of aircraft and flying them thousands of kilometers across the country. They're racing to build the counterpart to the American Space Shuttle, a rival spacecraft and launch system called Energia-Buran. Like earlier Soviet spacecraft, it's being built here at aerospace manufacturing facilities in the West, and it'll be launched here, thousands of kilometers away. But unlike earlier spacecraft, Energia-Buran components are too large to be transported using railways, so they'll have to be airlifted. In a rush, the Soviets convert 1950s-era bombers for the job. But the planes aren't up to the task. They can only lift smaller components, and even those have to be stripped down to make them as light as possible. To carry fully assembled components, some of which are nearly 60 meters long, the Soviets are going to need a much bigger plane. The Americans solved their need to transport space shuttles by converting Boeing 747s into shuttle carriers. The jumbo jet was an ideal plane for the job. Large and powerful, it was modified by reducing weight, strengthening its fuselage, and adding additional stabilizers. And unlike the Soviets, the Americans would also use rail lines, and the largest components would be transported over water using barges. Only the shuttle orbiter would need to be airlifted. The Soviets, on the other hand, would need to airlift their entire launch system, including giant rocket boosters and core stages. And with Soviet leadership pressing to start launches in 1988, engineers had little time to come up with a solution. So naturally, they looked to the largest plane the Soviet Union had to offer. Under development in the early 1980s, the Antonov An-225 would enter service as the largest and most capable transport in the world, and just in time for Energia-Buran launches. But even the enormous An-225 wasn't going to cut it. Engineers would have to make the plane even larger. And to do it, they'd lengthen the fuselage and add root extensions to increase the wingspan. For more power, they'd give the plane 2 more engines. With a strengthened fuselage, the new plane would easily carry a Buran orbiter. But larger components would obstruct the tail, so engineers redesigned the vertical stabilizer. To deal with the new plane's immense weight and to prevent it from damaging runways, they'd give it a new landing gear, distributing weight across 32 wheels. Larger and more capable, this new titan of the skies would be designated as the An-225. The An-225 is unlike any aircraft in the world. 6 turbofans put out a staggering 309,000 pounds of thrust, giving it the ability to lift nearly double the payload of its Western contemporaries. It's a plane so large the Wright brothers could have made their first flight entirely inside its cargo hold. The 225's primary mission would be to carry Energia-Buran components, but designers also envisioned using the plane to do what had never been done before: launch spacecraft into orbit directly from midair. That's because the 225 would be powerful enough to fly a fully fueled spaceplane and its payload up to the lower stratosphere, where it would then launch at an altitude of 8 kilometers, allowing it to reach orbit at 1/10 the cost of launching from the ground. The reusable launch system would complement the Energia-Buran, and its development was well underway by 1988. The Soviets planned to build several Antonov An-225s to serve as the backbone of their space program for decades to come. In November of 1988, the Soviets stunned the world with the first unmanned launch of a Buran. Up until that point, few in the West would have had any idea that the Soviets had developed their own version of the space shuttle. In the following year, the Soviets gave Western audiences a first-hand look as the enormous Tu-25 carried a Buran to the Paris Air Show. The monstrous plane drew crowds, but experts were puzzled. To get to the air show, the Soviets had flown their brand new spacecraft right through a rainstorm, a move NASA would have considered reckless with their space shuttle. But by this point, damaging the Buran was the least of the Soviet Union's concerns, because by 1989 the country was going bankrupt and could no longer afford the Energia-Buran, and it meant that the spacecraft would never launch again. Without the need to airlift orbiters, core stages, and boosters, the Tu-25 was paraded around at Western air shows, while the Soviets struggled to find an alternative use for the giant plane. And it seemed like nothing was off the table. One proposal considered using the Tu-25 to deploy chronoplanes for maritime rescue missions. The British looked at using the plane as a launch platform for their own proposed spaceplane. And at one point, there was even a proposal for a massive triple-deck airliner. But none of these plans ever materialized. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and before long the Tu-25 was sent into storage outside of Kiev, Ukraine, where it was scavenged for parts. The world's largest plane now seemed destined for the scrapyard. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's Antonov Design Bureau struggled to find customers for their aircraft. But they did find a new source of revenue, chartering out their existing fleet to fly cargo. With An-124s having more lifting power than any aircraft in the world, Antonov found a brisk business transporting everything from giant electrical generators to locomotives. But every so often they'd get a request to fly cargo that even their 124s couldn't manage. By the late 90s, the case for resurrecting the giant Tu-25 was building. But it wasn't a straightforward decision. Unlike the smaller 124, which was purpose-built for cargo, the Tu-25 was a relic of the Soviet space program, with a fuselage heavily reinforced to handle external payloads. And unlike the 124, the plane had no rear cargo door, which would slow the process of loading cargo. But Antonov bet that the plane could fill a niche, and after years in storage, $20 million were invested into new engines, modernized avionics, and a new strengthened cargo hold. On its first chartered flight in January of 2002, the Tu-25 carried a payload of 187 tons, a feat that would have otherwise required 2 Boeing 747 freighters. The world's largest plane had been given a new lease on life, carrying cargo that would have otherwise been impossible to fly. And over the course of the next 2 decades, the Tu-25 set new world records for the immense payloads it transported. But the plane's outsized capabilities come with outsized costs. At upwards of $30,000 an hour to operate, the Tu-25 only flies when no other aircraft can do the job. And with only one of the type ever produced, the giant plane remains in a class of its own, drawing crowds wherever it flies. A second half-finished Tu-25 has sat in storage for more than 30 years, and despite regular headlines about how it one day might be finished, it's not certain if there will ever be enough demand for a second spacecraft transporter turned cargo plane.